The next presentation is from Maestro Paul MacDonald, who is based in the Scottish borders. And so we will now hear from Maestro MacDonald.
Hello and welcome to MacDonald Armouries right here in the Scottish borders. It really is a privilege and an honour to be asked to present as part of the Association for Historical Fencing's Grand Assault event, and I've been asked today to present on a very particular topic and one very close to my own heart and fencing career, that specifically about the single stick itself. So I want to cover something about the history of it and its different uses in martial training over time as well. So let's get down to tax with it. So we're specifically going to look at the single stick with its basket hilted form here, which of course was the training tool originally for the basket hilted sword. But of course the single stick has a much more ancient origin story than that, as wooden training weapons have been evidenced in ancient culture, certainly as far back as the Roman period. So in the early centuries AD, of course steel swords and swordsmanship were using swordsmen were using wooden training weapons. Now, no great surprise there, and I have absolutely no doubt, even though we've not got the records of it from the Bronze Age, that Bronze Age swordsmen would have been using sticks simply as training tools in that sense. So it can be said that the single stick has probably one of the longest lineages in martial training in the world in that way. But we're going to look, as I say, at the basket hilted form, which of course it was the principal training tool for the basket hilted sword. Now, what does the single stick have to be in the first place to be a good tool for that? Well, the blade, like a good sword, is the most important element, and it has to be of the right dimensions, it has to be of the right form, and it has to be of the right material. And this is crucial when it comes to making a good single stick today, because in making them today we have to make them just as they made them historically as well, from same materials. There have been a lot of compromises, I would say, in recent history, and recent HEMA, dare I say it, historical fencing history, in reproducing training tools even, so I will address that as well. Now, in essence, the single stick in the basket hilt form is very simple. It is a blade of a length replicating exactly what you would expect for the steel sword itself, and the basket, very simple, of either wicker or leather construction. These are hilts that have to be manufactured quite cheaply, quite efficiently, but resilient enough to take a fair amount of pounding and cutting at the user's wrist, knuckles, hand area. So these are the two materials that come into play in doing that. Now, this form of wicker, the European willow, is used for the wicker baskets in itself. It's extremely strong and resilient. It can take incredible abuse and survive very well. You probably wouldn't see it if I were to do it, but if I was to place this basket on the ground, I could stand on it with my full weight and it would support that. So it's incredibly strong when you weave it into a tight structure like this. So let's have a look a little specifically at the basket itself. The basket itself, ideally your diameter here has to be about 6 inches to accommodate both types of grips you would expect, your hammer grip or your full thumb on back grip like this. Now, one wee aspect worth noting is that your holes here have to be offset, so this is slightly further down the basket than this one. This one sits slightly closer to the edge, and the reason for that is very simple. You put the point through the hole nearest the edge first, and that means you've got minimal interruption of your wrist when you're manipulating and manoeuvring the blade in all directions as it reproduces the steel basket. And you have a little bit of back protection here that really emulates the back protection you would have to guard your wrist more than anything on the steel sword. Now, the earliest depiction I believe we have of the basket-hilted single stick in this form is from 1612, from an event in the south of England called the Cotswold Olympics, which is still held to this day. It's an ancient traditional event that's still going, and in a poster advertising, I think, the event from 1612, there's various activities and sports and games going on, and in the top right hand corner you can see two fencers, and they've each got a wicker basket, because you can see the detail that it's a wicker basket single stick, and in the offhand they also have wicker basketed daggers, exactly like this as well. And I think this is the earliest depictions that we have of the basket-hilted single stick. So early 17th century, but of course there would have been wicker baskets like this, and leather baskets no doubt, throughout the 16th century, when the basket hilt was around. We start to see the real development of the broadsword hilt into a full basket, distinguishing from simple knuckle bows and side branches. The full basket going on for symmetrical basket in the early to mid 16th century. 1530s, 40s is that period where the basket's becoming a full hand protective basket in that sense. So absolutely, fencing masters and such would have come up with the simplest tool for the job, for the training of it, and that is it. And of course it remained the training tool for the basket-hilted sword through the 17th, through the 18th century, and it continued in use through the 19th century as the basket hilt itself, basket-hilted broadsword, develops. From the middle to late 18th century is where we see the next transition of the basket-hilted sword in a military, in a regimental capacity, to move on hilt-wise to become the sabre, in essence, the military sabre. Now in the 19th century even, the military sabre is still referred to as the broadsword, so it's really still seen as the same weapon as this ancient old basket hilt that it came from in the first place. And of course the single stick was still the training tool for that right through. So there was a change in the purpose though of the basket, but let's firstly have a look at the blade, which is the crucial thing. Now I'm removing the basket so you can see my hand on the stick here. Let's say your two main grips for the broadsword. Over time we're hammer grip, thumb and back, and your hilt has to be big enough to accommodate that, but crucially the grip has to be good enough to grip well, and what we find works is a stick of around 1 inch maximum diameter is ideal, absolutely spot on for an effective grip that you can manipulate with fingers and thumb quite well and easily, and it's not too small, it's not too chunky, so 1 inch maximum diameter. But crucially of all is we still need actually a bit of flex. Ideally for a single stick blade, it has to receive and survive over time. They are expendable to an extent, but you still don't want to be going through a single stick every training session for sure, and really every week's not ideal. So you want a single stick to last you months, and you'll get a year or two actually out of a good stick. And the optimum material for this is ash. European ash is the tempered steel of the wood world. It has resilience at its heart, and it can take an incredible amount of concussive abuse and survive quite well. When it does splinter, you don't tend to see bits fly off as such, but it splinters like an onion. It layers. The outer layer will chip first, and it will slowly split through the other layers until eventually the strength is compromised enough for it to break altogether. But you can peel bits of the layers off and add a bit of tape, masking tape or such, to actually increase the longevity over time. So European ash, if you can find it, and it is worth importing if you have to. I'm aware it's not common to find in Americas at all, but yeah, it's very much worth the importing because it is absolutely the traditional and the best medium for your single stick blade. I will contrast that with a material and a wood type that is not ideal, such as hickory. Now, hickory has been used more recently for making single stick blades, but why is it not ideal? It's too dense, it's too heavy, and if you end up within your hand something that's actually going to be heavier and more balance forward than a steel blade, a steel sword, you're kind of countering what you're aiming to do in the first place, which is make and use a wieldable weapon that replicates at least the balance of the steel sword, because then you can do the same techniques just as effectively. So be wary that you're not picking up hickory and imagining it to be a good single stick. It will not be. It will be too dense. You will leave rather significant bruising on your training partners, and I'm sure they won't thank you for that. They certainly wouldn't be buying you a drink in the pub after if you're cracking a rib or two on them. So that's why it's not ideal. It's too dense, too heavy. So European ash absolutely is ideal. Where you can't find that, any fruit-bearing trees are usually good, where you can find branches long and straight enough, or perhaps steam them straight enough. Fruit-bearing wood is very resilient in its form. In fact, it tends to grow a little dense as well, and certainly for canes, for Italian or French canes, these can be good. But certain types can be good also for getting to the right dimensions, 1 inch maximum diameter for single sticks as well. So, in essence, for our blade and for our basket, we have our optimum materials. And of course, the easiest manner in which to secure at the end is a simple peg through the basket, and that's really all you have to do. You shouldn't have any problems with it from there. Your alternative is to create and stitch up a simple form, but thick enough form of leather basket. And if you have a means or a leatherworking friend who can harden leather as well, then that makes a major difference in how long this will last as well. This is my own personal basket. It has done me, I don't know. I think this was made not long after the Academy was founded in 2001. So it's been the best part of 20 years this has done me, and it's still structurally solid, and it will last me another 20, I'm quite sure as well. So in terms of materials and form, that's ideal. But there's an aspect of the single stick basket I'd like to address that I don't feel has probably been addressed to date. So this may even be a worldwide exclusive for you. Here we go. And that's talking about the balance of a single stick. And why is that important? Because we want to affect the same techniques and movements as effectively as the steel sword moves itself. So we have to affect the same balance in our single sticks as we do the steel sword. Now, what are we looking at for that? Let's have a closer look. Here's a few swords here. The basket hilt here is one I crafted from the Inverary collection, from the Duke of Argyll's collection, and my challenge to myself was to make this as accurate as possible to the original, not just in form and materials, but to the weight, and to get the weight to the same gram as the original. So this is 936 grams, I got there in the end. I'll just give you a closer look as to where it's balancing. So I'm pinching that just with thumb and forefinger, and that balance point down from the guard is about 3 fingers. And that is an excellent example of an extremely lightweight and fast, well balanced original. So from about 3 fingers width of balance, this is my own training sword that I've made to be a very, very functional, very accurate weight and balance as well. So let's see where that balance is. Pinching there, slightly down. And that's balancing out, not quite a 3, so that's 4 fingers down from the guard. That's balancing. And I would say that's quite a typical weight and balance for basket-hilted swords, about 4 fingers width down. This is Rob Roy McGregor's, used to be, he's no longer around, and this dates from about 1680, 1690. It is on the heavier end of a basket, so we've got a good weight range of light, medium and heavy weight baskets. This weighs 2.8 pounds in all, and if we find the balance point, it should be about here, and we're finding that's about 5 fingers width down from the guard. On the heavier end, but still well balanced with a good pommel on the other side, so she still moves quite nimbly. So 3, 4 and 5 fingers on a essentially light, medium and heavier weight basket. So what do we have an approximation right here with the leather basket, and if we look in close and do the same little simple balance test. Now she's balancing 3 to 4, 3.5 fingers down there, so that for me is quite acceptable, spot on. And here with the wicker basket of course being a little bit lighter than the leather basket, it's a bit denser, but of course you have slight differences across the weights of sticks as well. So what do we have here? There she balances, and there she's sitting about 5 fingers down. So again, acceptable, and within what we can expect of the balance of a good steel basket sword. Now this is crucial, really. The balance in this sense is more important because we're compromising the weight, and that we're using a lighter training tool than the sword. Not much. A good single stick should be half to 2/3, I would suggest, of the weight overall of a good broadsword, and around that halfway mark is probably ideal. So it's even more important that your balance point is the same, so that in the hand the blade moves exactly as you would expect it to move. So when you pick up the steel blade, there's no difference in the movement. You've only got a little additional weight to deal with and control your hand movement with. That's it. So that is, I would say one of the most important aspects of a good single stick. Not just the right materials, but I think if you get the right materials together, then you'll find that the balance is there. It naturally works out that way. So throughout the 16th, the 17th, the 18th century, we have the single stick being used as the optimum, the ideal and perfect lightweight and expendable training tool for the basket-hilted sword. Moving through, as the sword moves and develops to become the military sabre, and then military sabre being taught in a regimental sense, the single stick is still that weapon that is used. The swordsmanship in the military schools, though, being a little bit simpler. You're teaching a room full of squaddies, we've all got a limited attention span, but you're teaching in a military style, a disciplined manner of perhaps a numbered system, or shouting orders for the defences, for the attacks and so on, and building the sequences up with your room. And we do see the single stick in itself becoming a martial tool and a martial weapon in itself. Now this is in the sporting form of single stick, and it looks as though we start to see that derive in the early to mid 19th century, and this is what becomes known as cudgelling in its own right. Now cudgelling is a term that crosses a couple of stick weapon forms. It is applicable to the shillelagh, the Irish stick, bata. It is applicable still to, and it's used to describe the single stick as well. And your cudgelling form of single stick was your sporting form of play. that you would find at English country fairs. And at those fairs you'd find a raised stage with your open challenges being given. Those challenges being given at pugilism, bare knuckle boxing, at wrestling and at swordsmanship. But to keep things a bit cleaner for a family audience, the open displays you would find in the 18th century of sporting swordsmanship and challenges such as Donald MacBain entered into the fray with James Figg and the likes, and many of the famous names in that day. Bloodshed was quite common actually on the stage with these swords. So perhaps this was seen as a cleaner way in which to still have a manly contest in a way, and a manly challenge, but without losing as much blood at least. And so single sticks were used with head-only target area. And we see different rules applied in different counties in England as to what scored as a hit and what won about that way. The head was the only target, and we're talking about from the temples up to the top of the head, the crown of the head in this sense. You weren't aiming to break the jaws or so on. That's considered a bit unsporting. And you would each take to your guard position, where footwork generally wasn't allowed. This was seen as a manly trial of skill, martial ability, and so you had to stand your ground. In some places you could lose altogether for moving your feet backwards at least. So some places you stood actually toe to toe, the advanced toes being toe to toe. So you'd move the body back and forward a little more that way with that style. In others you're facing each other more or less square on, and you'd both take initially to a high guard, such as a hanging guard with blades crossed. And from then, when the signal was given, I can't do the full movements here, I've got a rather low ceiling, but you would be giving full and rapid forceful moulinets to defend yourself and throw solid cuts and strikes at your opponent. Now, distracting blows were a good tactic actually, because you might break or fracture a rib in doing that, but you're not breaking the man altogether. So giving a solid strike at a boy's ribs to get his guard and his blade down, to follow up with a cracker to the head, was a good technique. And also striking the ulnar, the funny bone, on the elbow, again to get the reaction of shifting that guard position to open the head up. It's a tremendous sporting activity, martial endeavour, and of course you can play this with masks on and elbow protection and crack on with it, and it's quite a vigorous fencing exercise, and it does promote a good deal of skill as well, because it is a very limited target area that you're aiming to, and to defend and throw full powerful moulinets with it, consistently, while preserving your energy so your arm is not tiring, is quite an effort. So I can highly recommend cudgelling and head-only single stick today, for the same reasons they would have promoted it back then too. So where do we see that? When do we see this appear again? Early to mid 19th century. And like I said, the rules changed, the rules varied from county to county. In some counties it was the first inch of blood drawn on the head. In other counties it was the first drop of blood on the white shirts they would have worn. So, when you crack a skull with a round ash stick, trust me, it doesn't bleed first time usually. It has to be, a pretty solid, fast, concussive blow to break the skin on the head with a stick like that. And so you might be striking or getting struck in the same spot 2 or 3 or 4 times before the blood is drawn. So it's good, solid, brutal stuff in that sense. So that was a martial shift, if you like, from the single stick being a training weapon in its own right for the steel sword to becoming a martial form of fencing in its own right. And we see it still being used throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century in fewer and fewer regiments and forces in that sense, because of course the sword became something much less applicable on the battlefield and was something not taught as much. But I was taught my first single stick lesson by Professor Bert Bracewell, who's sadly no longer with us. And he was one of the greatest fencing masters that Scotland has known. And he learned his single stick from Colonel Hay. Colonel Hay developed what was called the Calp rules of single stick. Calp was the old name for Gibraltar. And he taught single stick in the British Army during the war years and post-war years in the 50s, and he developed the Calp rules of single stick, and I got to know those firsthand through a rather vigorous, I was thrown in at the deep end with Bert, who just told me to pick up a single stick and said, it's in the round, and there's no timing, so you can cut and cut again, go! And that was it. That was my first immersion into single stick, and I loved every second of it. So there we go. That's a brief history of one of our great traditional training tools, probably the most ancient traditional training tool there is. The great thing about these is, well, they do grow on trees. So get out there, cut yourself a single stick, and train hard. Cheers.
Thank you to Maestro MacDonald. Are you with us?
I am. Hello.
Hello. So good evening. So we have accumulated a few questions, including from some of the other presenters. So we have a few minutes, but please do bear in mind, for those of you who scheduled your time to be done within our 2 hours, we are running a bit behind. So once we finish the questions here, we'll be seeing one more presentation, hopefully with a few questions. So we do apologize in advance for going over time. But first to the questions. So let's see, there's a question about, well, you had mentioned that they grow on sticks. Are there any makers of traditional single sticks using, willow baskets or using, European ash, as you said, where people can hope to source them from? Or is it really a question that you've got to be prepared to make your own if you want the real stuff?
I think more the latter, yes. I'm not aware, to be honest, of any other single stick makers offering them with ash sticks, although there might be out there that I haven't found. I would recommend finding a material source for walking sticks, and you'll often find that they can provide you with good straight coppiced ash sticks, and that's what you're after. I used to buy them from a stick material source, and I think it was 40-inch overall length is your ideal total single stick length, and I can't remember what they arrived at. It was 45 or 46 inches as your raw material, and you just find the best part of that to cut and cut it to size. So it's quite easy, and obviously you round the point and remove any little burrs and such, that are sticking up, and make it as straight and smooth as possible. And that way you've got a tapered natural ash stick. So I think that's the best way forward. Find the right material source and make your own.
Now, you just mentioned tapering. So when we had the presentation on the Italian scherma de bastone, there was a mention that those are really, they're tapered sticks, they're conical. So they have a different dimension, quite a different dimension from one end to the other. Is it also the case that applies to the single stick?
Certainly for natural sticks, yes, because natural sticks have that taper to them, and I imagine it's for exactly the same reasons the Italian sticks were tapered to. They're using natural sticks, grown and coppiced quite possibly as well, and you've got that natural taper to it. What I would advise is to avoid turned sticks if you can. Certainly preference and prioritize natural sticks over turned sticks any day, because the turning will cut into the grain of the stick down its length, and it's more likely to start to splinter sooner under concussive work.
I see. That makes sense. So a couple other quick questions. So the question is around edge discipline. So it's a stick, right? But since the single stick was in origin training for the sword, how does essentially, and depending on exactly the sword, it may have a different edge configuration. So do we find or do you imagine that single sticks in different periods were a bit different dimensionally depending on what they were training for, or it does I guess this is a combination question, but the other question is that I think to your point, someone was asking, should the dimension of the stick be altered from the round in order to give you more sense that there is an edge? What you had just argued is that you don't want to machine it or mill it because you'll damage the grain and damage the longevity. So the discipline has to come from the actual training, the presentation.
Exactly. Yeah. As soon as you start cutting or filing into the section of the wood and cutting it and filing into the layers of the wood itself, the grain, then you will start to compromise the strength that way, the structural integrity. So it's generally not a good idea. Your stick will last longer simply if you don't do that. Your edge alignment and precision should come first, exactly as you suggested, from your form. And that form is from the placement often of if you're using a thumb on back or saber type grip, then it's that precision in your movement that is going to generate your edge discipline, even though it's a round stick. And this is something that I hammer into students from day one, always, as I'm sure I'm not the first fencing master to do so, in saying that you treat your round stick as an edged and a sharp blade at all times.
Fantastic. I guess this is probably a longer question, but there was one question around cudgeling, right? The idea, two gentlemen standing toe to toe with cudgels and having a go at each other's heads. That reminded one of our audience members of the German menswear. So the question is this independent evolution? Was there, was there a German tradition of single stick that ended up in the menswear, or we just don't know?
It's a great question. It's a really interesting one too, because they are certainly, in terms of what you're doing, you're standing still, you're standing your ground, and it's head only. Yes, absolutely, they're similar. We see absolutely, though, the differences arising with the different blade types, of course. The men's are having a squared point with two razor sharp 90-degree angles that you're slicing away at cheek or forehead. That brings about naturally different movements and techniques that a single stick wouldn't. You wouldn't be drawing blood necessarily from the head with a single stick. There's a different force involved in that sense. Did they evolve independently? I would think so, and I would suggest so first. That's without any form of evidence to back me up on that, but I think they developed separately. I do have an idea of an origin story, given the period the single stick head only appears and the other context that single sticks were used in at the time, and that they were used for training military saber. It's not an unlikely scenario to imagine an officer's mess. An officer's messes after dinner and after the ports can get very messy, I assure you, in that sense that, martial games are usual and usually happen at these events. So, there's a couple of single sticks in the corner, boys. Let's have a match. We've not got much room to play with. Stand your ground, head only, first to bleed, rules being developed ad hoc in a simple martial sense. That way, it becomes a little more popular over time and becomes a thing with it. So that's my own simple idea as to how it could have originated, given the other context of single stick at that same time.
Well, as we saw with Scherma de Bastone, there's a lot of research that is still to be done. So
absolutely,
with that speculation, I think we have to move on from questions, but bear in mind, if you do have to go, since we're now at time, we are recording this, and those recordings will become published by the AHF in due course. So thank you if you have to go, but we are going to continue with our final presentation. One more to go, and it's going to be interesting. It's going to tie some of these things together, I think. And so without further ado,